In this lesson, we're going to analyze discrimination. But before doing that, let's clearly distinguish the differences that exist between discrimination and prejudice. Refer to the 7th page of your second study guide. Likewise, highlight information you'll find in Chapter 9 in the text. Remember that prejudice is really an attitude. It's a prejudgment. Often we invest quite a bit in it. And although not all prejudices are negative, most of them tend to be. Now, on the other hand, discrimination is literally an act, an action. In other words, we unfairly treat others based upon a prejudice we hold toward those other folks. So if we act upon our attitudes, our prejudicial attitudes, and we treat the members of another group or category in a negative, a different way, we are in effect engaging in discrimination. Now, if you'll notice on page 7, there are two basic types of discrimination: individual and institutionalized. One of the more horrific examples of individual discrimination is lynching. Lynching got its name in part from James Lynch, a Virginia colonist who was a justice of peace. And this was the punishment he and his followers meted out for Tories, that is, loyalists to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War. The Tuskegee Institute initiated an elaborate study some years ago focusing on lynchings between 1882 and 1968. It was determined based upon the research that over 3,400 African Americans were lynched during that time period, and a little more than 1,200 whites were lynched. Some of the reasons that were used to justify the lynching of African Americans during that time period was throwing rocks, vagrancy, trying to vote, expecting respect, and disorderly conduct. Now, today, there are some examples that can highlight this particular type of discrimination. This gentleman, Matthew Shepard, he attended the University of Wyoming, and in October of 1998, after accepting a ride with two guys, they pistol whipped him, tortured him, and then strung out his body on a fence outside of town where he died. A factor that could have played a role in his murder was that he was gay. That same year, in June, this gentleman, James Byrd Jr., was dragged to death behind a pickup driven by two white men who had given him a ride. Studies indicate, medical studies to be precise, that he was probably alive during much of this ordeal until his body struck a culvert so violently that one of his arms was dislodged with his head. His killers dumped his body in front of a nearby African American cemetery. Now, also bear in mind that discrimination can sometimes be institutionalized. Notice, if you will, institutionalized discrimination has been around for a very long period of time. So long that people have literally taken it for granted. It's so built in the system, it's so pervasive, that it just makes sense to a lot of people. And because of that, it's really hard to recognize it. We've just gotten used to it, so to speak. And likewise, you want to remember that it can occur without what might be referred to as deliberate bigotry. What's that mean? Well, one interesting definition I came across of bigotry: enthusiastic or authentic intolerance. So you don't necessarily find any malicious intent in some forms of institutionalized discrimination. Now, if you'll go back to point A, remember it can be direct or it can be indirect. An example of direct institutionalized discrimination might be Jim Crow laws. Local laws that forbade African Americans, and in some cases other minorities, from entering certain occupations, barred them from voting, from owning property. On the other hand, there was a celebrated Supreme Court case in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. It put into motion what was referred to as separate but equal. When it came to public facilities, essentially again, they were to be separate and equal. They were definitely separate, but they were anything but equal. And this case was, in effect, rescinded in 1950 by another celebrated Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. Part of the motivation behind this was that in the Topeka, Kansas public school system, guess who was what kids were only permitted to ride in school buses? Turned out to be white students. But lately, many researchers, and by lately I mean particularly during the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st century, social scientists have attracted and focused a great deal of their attention on institutionalized discrimination. I think in large part because of the fact that it's been around so long, it tends to be taken for granted. Here's an example, sometimes referred to as redlining. Although it's illegal, there's probably still evidence that can be found that some loan agencies and banks still kind of employ it. In the old days, what happened at a bank or a loan agency, somebody would take a red pen and just mark off certain areas of a community that were heavily populated by low-income minorities. They became a bad risk. They didn't have collateral. But on the other hand, there were certain communities, often again those housed white folk with relatively good middle class and upper class incomes, where again, by and large, the notion was we can loan money to them. And again, banks and loan agencies defended themselves saying, well, this just makes good business sense. Not too long ago, there was an interesting case of a well-known pizza delivery service that had distributed to some of its managers a new software system that allowed those managers to mark certain neighborhoods by color. If a neighborhood was marked in green, full delivery; yellow, curbside delivery only; red, no delivery. But the big question was, how was this going to be decided? And the company didn't really provide any accurate answers. Was it based on arrest rates? Was it based on police stops? Or were the impressions simply subjective in nature? You know what I mean? That's a bad side of town. And even if official police records or other official data were employed, is it possible some of those could have been biased? But the main point to contemplate is this: even if a neighborhood is considered violent, does that mean everyone who lives in that neighborhood is violent or a criminal? And I think you would agree with me, absolutely not. And those folks are being discriminated against simply based upon where they live. Another interesting example of institutionalized discrimination involves this gentleman. Do you recognize him? He became president of the United States. But notice again, he attended Yale. And by his own admission, he wasn't the greatest of students. How in the world did he get in? Well, it had a great deal to do with this gentleman, his father, who attended Yale. So the legacy admission system is a process of granting extra admission points or setting aside spots for kids of alumni. A 2011 study done by Horowitz, focusing on 30 highly selective colleges and universities, indicated that, again, legacy status would more than triple your chances of admission. If you were a primary legacy, that is to say, a son or a daughter of an alumnus, that boosted your chance by almost 46% of getting in. Now, at the same time, there are some other examples of institutionalized discrimination that are frankly disturbing. The Education Department, for example, noted that in an elaborate study that minority students are less likely to have access to advanced math and science classes. For example, a quarter of the schools with the highest percentage of Black and Latino students don't offer Algebra 2, and 1/3 of these schools don't offer chemistry. Also, only a quarter of these students were enrolled in advanced placement classes. Another interesting illustration: when students were secluded and restrained, the data shows that students with disabilities make up roughly 12% of all students, but they make up 60% of the students placed in seclusion or in involuntary confinement, and they make up 75% of the students who are restrained at school. Now, during the administration of Lyndon Baines Johnson, a federal law was passed designed to reduce the impact of institutionalized discrimination, referred to as affirmative action. The approach was to initiate positive steps to ensure that racial minorities and women are not informally discriminated against in their access to higher education, employment, or promotion. Now, many people took this to imply that, well, unqualified people were being given preferences. That's not the case. Essentially, the program sets goals and timetables for the hiring of minorities in governmental agencies and in other large organizations that receive federal funding in the form of contracts or direct funding, if you will. Now, more often than not, the goals are but targets, and there aren't any sanctions against the organizations or the employers as long as they demonstrate they're making good faith efforts to meet those goals to attract minorities. Now, needless to say, this has generated a massive amount of controversy. Some people accusing the program of being reverse discrimination or suggesting that it implies the current generation is being punished for the sins of the past. We'll see what lies ahead with respect to affirmative action. In the next lesson, we're going to concentrate on analyze in some detail prejudice.